Warm welcome to this session today that we are starting while colleagues are still finding their way from other events that are just wrapping up now. So we're here to launch the policy brief of the Special Rapporteur on the right to education, on protecting the right to education in armed conflict. And it's a real pleasure to welcome all of you here in the room, but also those online. And of course, our distinguished speakers, of whom two are still on their way to find us. So first of all, a very warm thank you to the Special Rapporteur on the right to education for this very important policy briefing and for co-organizing this launch event with us, the Geneva Global Hub for Education in Emergencies, and GCPA, the Global Coalition to Protect Education from Attack. A very sincere thank you also to our co-sponsors, the permanent missions to the UN of Colombia, Norway, Portugal, and Spain. Today's event couldn't be timelier, with around 130 armed conflicts being fought around the world, a figure that has more than doubled in the last 15 years. Conflicts are proliferating across the globe, from Gaza to Ukraine to Myanmar and Sudan. And access to education is often the first casualty. By the end of 2024, 1 in 6 children, or more than 473 million, lived in or were fleeing conflict zones. And of these children, some 85 million didn't have access to education at all. If we compare this to the size of a country, this would be more than the entire population of Germany. So this is why this brief is so important, to remind us why protecting schooling is so vital in conflict and to provide a practical roadmap for what we can do. We are very honored to have a very distinguished panel with us today, and I'll introduce them shortly. But before that, we hear directly from young people who have experienced firsthand the devastating impact that conflict has on education. And for that, I invite you to turn your attention to the screens, where we first will have a video message from Similar Ground. This is a refugee and youth-led organization who's supporting a Voice More advocacy group in the Bidibidi refugee settlement in northern Uganda.
Hi, I am Mata Francis.
And I'm Harriet.
I'm Stella.
I'm Raymond.
I am Sam. We are Voice More youth group in Uganda under Similar Ground.
Education has been my support as a refugee. It's more than just learning. It's about hope and building a bright future. Through education, we gain skills and confidence in overcoming challenges.
However, we do face significant challenges like overcrowded classrooms, limited resources, and language barrier. Often, it's hard for us to learn effectively and reach our full potential.
Despite these challenges, education have transformed ourselves, gives us to bring big contribute to our communities and to break the cycle of displacement.
Many refugee young ones are interested in school, but however, financial gaps hinders their education journey. I urge the International Committee to create more scholarships for the refugee young ones. The more scholarships, the more children in school.
Teachers are the heart of education system. So we need more trained teachers, which are both refugees and hosts. That will inspire us, refugees, to learn effectively.
We urgently call on the global community to stand with us and support refugee education. Together we can break barriers, create opportunities, and empower every refugee youth to success and quality education.
A very big thank you to the youth from Similar Ground for their message, which is very well received here in this room and certainly also online. And we have 2 more interventions, both from Afghanistan and from Bangladesh, from another refugee camp. But first, again online, we will hear from Pashtana Durrani, the Executive Director of Learn Afghanistan, which provides education for girls through a network of underground schools and online classes.
Thank you. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, The right to education doesn't end when war begins. It becomes more urgent. As the Special Rapporteur's report reminds us, education in armed conflicts is not only a legal obligation, but a human right imperative and a foundation for lasting peace. Today, over 234 million children are affected by crisis, and more than 52 million are out of school in conflict-affected countries. Attacks on education have risen by 166% since 2021. Each destroyed classroom represents not just a building lost, but a generation's future lost and stolen. At Learn Afghanistan, I have witnessed these consequences firsthand. One of our students, Meena, lost her father to post-war complications. Soon after, her family, crushed by debt, attempted to marry her off at just 15. Not out of malice, but out of desperation. Through Learn's teacher and community network, we intervened, brought her back to school, and provided financial support so her family could survive without selling their children's future. Meena is now completing secondary school and dreams of supporting her family and staying with them. But for every Meena we reach, there are hundreds we cannot. This is why we need binding international and national mechanisms that ensure girls like Meena are never viewed as commodities to be traded in the times of crisis. Their education, safety, dignity must be non-negotiable, protected not only by the humanitarian response, but by law and by community systems and by political will. Excellencies, these priorities are clear. First, states must protect schools as civilian sanctuaries. These state schools' declaration must be universally endorsed and implemented. And military use of educational facilities must be criminalized. Secondly, accountability must replace impunity. Attacks on education, child recruitment, forced marriage are war crimes and must be prosecuted as such. Third, education must be integrated into every emergency response, and I cannot stress how much. As a life-saving service, it is protection in its purest form, shielding children from exploitation, violence, while restoring stability and hope. The protection of children's bodies, minds, and futures is a shared duty and one that extends beyond the UN, beyond resolutions, to every government, commander, and community leader. When we safeguard learning, we safeguard life itself. Let us ensure that no child anywhere is ever again treated as a collateral in someone else's war. Thank you.
Thank you very much to you, Pashtana, for sharing the very inspiring work that you are doing, but also for making very clear asks to the international community, but also, of course, to national leader and civil society. Now, the last youth speaker, but not least, Saidul Mustafa, a Rohingya youth leader and head of the Rohingya Youth Advocacy Group in Cox's Bazar refugee camp in Bangladesh. Over to you, Saidul.
Good afternoon, and delegates, and your colleagues. I sincerely thanks to all organizers and to the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. I am Said Mustafa from the world's largest refugee camp. I would like to share the most important story of my own life. That reflect the experience of thousands of Rohingya refugees. In 2012, I was about to start grade 6 when a lockdown in our area, a small unverified incident led widespread violence. The government took side of Rakhine community and stopped all the school facilities of Rohingya communities. the conflict between Rakhine communities and Rohingya communities. I had no choice but to work on a farm. A year later, I saw my friend were going to a school, while I remained behind. In that time, one day, my father, my 65 years old father, said to me, "Don't be like your father. Be a man who can work for your community." And he also advised me, even a little education is better than a lifetime of farming. When I chose this path at your age, I didn't realize that it would stay with me at this 65 years old. His word gave me courage, and I started my education again in 2014. But my education was again cut short. Again cut short in 2016, eighth grade, grade 8. And I started I returned to a school in 2012, in 2014, but my education was again cut short at grade 8 when I was forced to flee to Bangladesh in 2016. Now I am safe, but still not a graduate. With my little education, I have a strong hope to create an educational pathway for refugees. Please keep me in mind if you want to review my proposal plan. And today, I want to say this is not only a Rohingya issue. Around the world, from Arakan state to Gaza, Sudan to Ukraine, schools are bombed, teachers are killed, and millions of children lost their right to learn. In Myanmar, over 2/3 of schools in conflict are destroyed or closed. We must remember, schools are civilian space, not never battlefields. Therefore, I call international community to take 3 urgent actions. Implement the Safe School Declaration, but not in words. It is in practice. Guarantee access to formal and higher education for all the refugees, regardless their status or age. Recognize community-based and alternative learning as a valid pathway toward accredited education. Education is not a privilege. It is a human right. It must be free, inclusive, and protected. In war, when we protect education, we protect hope, dignity, and the future. And somewhere is a nation. Thank you for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Saidul, for taking the time today and speaking to us all. We have heard you in Pashtana and to you from similar ground very clearly. You have lived through the most difficult situations, but you're standing up today, and I'm sure every day, for your communities and for the children and young people in your communities, so they can all access a quality education. So thank you very much. We're now turning back into the room and to the opening remarks. Very pleased to have His Excellency Marcos Gómez Martínez, the Ambassador and Permanent Representative of Spain to the United Nations Office here in Geneva with us. And Ambassador, I'm handing over to you for the opening remarks, please.
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us in this event that we are really proud to co-sponsor. It is indeed for me a pleasure and an honor to join you to join the Special Rapporteur in the launch of her policy brief. We strongly welcome it. It comes at a crucial moment where you are all aware education is under attack in many different contexts in the world, with dramatic effects, long-term effects that will impact on our lives. What happens now in Gaza, in the Ukraine, in Sudan, in Afghanistan, across the Sahel or in Myanmar will impact on our daily lives. There are whole generations of kids from these places that have no hope, that are being killed, that have been out of school for years, and one can only imagine what will happen in a few years with them. So the policy brief, together with the Special Rapporteur's early report on the right to safety in education, does provide a comprehensive and human rights-based framework to protect learning in conflict situations. And we believe that both documents speak with one voice, that the safety and continuity of education are not optional, that they are integral to human dignity and to sustainable peace. They also call for stronger accountability, for better data, the prevention of the military use of schools, and justice for victims of attacks on education. They connect powerfully with the Safe Schools Declaration, was mentioned by the previous speaker. Spain has supported this declaration since its inception, and we continue to promote it as a global political and moral commitment. We welcome that this year's forum, social forum, focuses on right to education, because it does provide the opportunity to build coherence across the system, to link the social forum's broad human rights agenda with the specific protection challenges that education faces in conflict and crisis. So we need to bridge the gap between this global policy and local implementation. We think that the forum is an adequate tool to advocate for this. We would, my country in this context, extremely complex, would call on all states to take two concrete steps. First of all, for all of them who have not yet done so, to endorse the Safe Schools Declaration. There is an excellent opportunity to do that at the 5th conference that will be taking place in Nairobi later in the month. And secondly, we would call on all states to use the Special Rapporteur's reports and the Social Forum outcomes as guiding tools to strengthen national legislation and policies, military doctrine, and education sector planning. My country will continue to support these efforts. We ourselves will bring to Nairobi our commitment to national and regional initiatives and to advance a rights-based approach to education in armed conflict. We all know that education is not just about learning. It is about protection, stability, and hope. It is future. It is the first building block for sustainable peace. So let us act on the vision that Farida Shahid, the Special Rapporteur, and the Human Rights Council have given us, a world where every child can learn safely. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you, Ambassador, for starting us off in this conversation with very clear recommendations, and also, of course, a big thank you to Spain for their continued commitment to protecting education. Now, we do have a small change in our program. It was foreseen that Ms. Vanessa Frazier, recently appointed as the UN Special Representative for Children in Armed Conflict, would be joining us today, but now she is unfortunately unable to do so. Of course, we thank her very much, her office, for the continued engagement, and we're pleased to welcome a representative who will speak. to us now again online. It's Mr. Nicolas Gérard, who's the Chief of Monitoring, Reporting and Regional Partnerships Unit at the Office of the SRSG CAC. Mr. Gérard, over to you.
Merci, thank you very much, and good morning from New York. The apologies of the special representative who would have liked to join you today but is unable to do so. I will read her remarks on her behalf. Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, it is a great honor to join you today for the launch of the policy brief on protecting the right to education in armed conflict. I wish to begin by expressing my sincere appreciation to the Office of the Special Rapporteur on the right to education for convening this event, but also to the Geneva Global Hub for Education in Emergencies and the Global Coalition to Protect Education from Attack for their tireless work in advancing this critical agenda. I also thank the governments of Colombia, Norway, Portugal, and Spain for co-sponsoring this event. The launch of the policy brief comes at a crucial time. Around the world, from Ukraine to the occupied Palestinian territory and Israel, from Haiti to Afghanistan, and from Mozambique to Myanmar, education, a fundamental right for every child across the world, is under unprecedented attack. Attacks against schools, including attacks against hospitals, are one of the 6 grave violations under my mandate. In addition, the military use of schools is also monitored as an issue of concern. In 2024 alone, the UN verified 1,265 attacks on schools, representing a staggering 68% increase in comparison to 2023. Behind each number is a child whose dream has been shattered, a teacher whose commitment has been tested, and a community whose future has been compromised. For example, in Colombia, 2 improvised explosive devices were planted beside a school by an armed group. As a result, children stopped attending classes. In Nigeria, some schools were closed owing to fear of attacks, which pushed children to engage in risky behaviors, and some joined armed groups due to idleness. For children living in conflict zones, schools represent far more than buildings where lessons are taught. Classrooms are places of safety, normalcy, and hope, a place that allows a child to imagine a future beyond the violence that surrounds it. As recognized in Security Council Resolution 2601, adopted in 2021, education is not only a human right, but a cornerstone of peace and security. This message comes to life in the words of a child from Chocó, Colombia, who told through our Prove It Matters campaign, I quote, "Peace is built in the classroom. Protecting education means defending the rights of girls, boys, and young people to dream, grow, and transform the world. In context of violence, schools must be a refuge of hope. Let us protect education, because where there is learning, peace flourishes." End of quote. This is an inspiring reminder that children know what makes them feel safe and what gives them hope. Children are agents of change, and we owe them to listen and to act. The policy brief we launched today provides a powerful framework for action, one that outlines 8 urgent, actionable priorities for international and national actors to strengthen protection, accountability, and resilience. I commend the Special Rapporteur's call to strengthen the international and national mechanisms for accountability. Impunity remains one of the greatest obstacles to lasting protection, and attacks on education too often go unpunished. National legislation that criminalizes such acts is essential to deterrence and accountability. Some conflict-affected countries have criminalized attacks on schools in their legislation, such as the Central African Republic. I welcome the call of the Special Rapporteur for all states to fully implement international standards relevant to the protection of the right to education in armed conflict. The international legal framework ensuring children's right to education, including the Convention on the Rights of the Child in Articles 28 and 29, must be fully implemented by member states in times of peace and in times of war. The Safe Schools Declaration, endorsed by 121 states, represents a powerful tool for protecting education during armed conflict. However, just like the Convention on the Rights of the Child, endorsement alone is not enough. Implementation must follow. I welcome steps by countries such as the Central African Republic, Colombia, the Philippines, Mali, and Nigeria that have already begun to domesticate the principles of the Safe Schools Declaration into their national frameworks. These examples must be multiplied. I encourage states that have not yet done so to endorse the Safe Schools Declaration. Governments must prioritize the protection of education in their national policies, allocate sufficient resources, and work with all relevant partners to turn this commitment into reality. The policies brief's call to enhance systematic disaggregated data collection and monitoring on attacks on education is particularly timely. We must strengthen data collection and analysis, as data are crucial to inform action, accountability, and response. Indeed, action plans with parties to conflict listed for attacks against schools in the Secretary General's annual report on children and armed conflict provide the United Nations with a crucial framework for engagement with perpetrators to end and prevent this violation. To date, 5 action plans that contain specific measures to end and prevent attacks against schools are currently being implemented. One of them was signed with the armed groups in the Central African Republic, one with the government of South Sudan, and the most recent one with the Houthis in Yemen, who have been delisted in the 2025 annual report for the violation of attacks on schools and hospitals, owing to a decrease in this grave violation. As you can see, we have the right legal framework and the tools are numerous, but what is needed is their operationalization and domestication into national systems. And for that, sufficient resources need to be allocated. Otherwise, progress we make one year can be undone the next if we fail to sustain attention, resources, and accountability. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, without resources, man's mandate cannot deliver. The current financial crisis has a direct impact on the children and armed conflict agenda, and budget cuts are limiting the ability of child protection actors to monitor, verify, and respond to grave violations against children. The monitoring and reporting mechanism requires adequate resourcing to function effectively. This includes the capacity to document violations, to engage directly with armed forces and groups, to conduct field visits, and to develop, monitor, and implement action plans. Protecting education in times of armed conflict is not just a legal obligation, it is a moral imperative. When a school is destroyed, it is not just a building lost. It is a community's future that has been taken away. When a child's education is denied, the cost is not only borne by that child, but by all of us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gerard, for sharing with us the statement of the UN Special Representative. So I'm very honored now to turn over to the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Education, Farida Shahid, to present her policy brief on the right to education in armed conflict. Over to you.
Thank you so much. Excellencies, colleagues, students, friends, I'm delighted that we're finally launching the policy brief on protecting the right to education in armed conflict, which I also have presented the report to the General Assembly Third Committee last week. I really appreciate and thank Colombia, Norway, Portugal, and of course Spain for co-sponsoring this event, and my co-organizers, of course, who are here with me. I think the key thing to remember is that international norms protecting the fundamental right to education apply in situations of armed conflicts, and the obligations to respect, protect, and fulfill the right to education remain in force. And yet, of course, we have heard and we're seeing an alarming rise in the number of attacks on schools and universities, students and educators, and the military use of facilities, as we've heard. The most horrifying, perhaps, or the most startling is, of course, the scholasticide that we're seeing in Gaza. But there are other instances which have been cited. So this policy brief, as been said, proposes 8 interlinked policy actions, which we think present a fairly comprehensive agenda, from prohibition to prevention, from accountability to access, from emergency response to education for peace. It was developed not just by me, so I need to mention there's a lot of people who've been involved in putting it together, And I think when we work together, we can see the different perspectives. Invaluable contributions from the Special Representative of the Secretary General for Children and Armed Conflict, experts from OHCHR, from UNESCO, from UNICEF, from UNRWA, the Global Coalition to Protect Education from Attack, of course, the Geneva Academy of International Humanitarian Law and Human Rights, Geneva Call, Geneva Global Hub for Education and Emergencies, Global Survivors Fund, Right to Education Initiative, War Child, and Watch List on Children in Armed Conflict. I also want to thank our brilliant youth speakers who really put into vividly the reality of what happens. Briefly, let me talk about the policies. The first, of course, is to fully implement international standards which are relevant to the protection of the right to education in armed conflict based on binding obligations of international humanitarian, human rights, and criminal law, and of course to close protection gaps. But I think it's also time that we push the envelope in our thinking of what this means. For example, international humanitarian law prohibits attacks against civilian objects, including schools, but when used for military purposes, educational institutions may lose their protected civilian status, thereby exposing teachers, students, and other civilians to heightened risks of grave harm. International law doesn't explicitly prohibit military use of educational institutions, but by triggering the loss of protection and endangering civilians, usage does potentially violate obligations such as ensuring the continuing function of institutions essential to children's well-being, which includes schools, facilitating access to education, and taking feasible precautions to avoid harming civilians and civilian objects. It also violates obligations under international human rights law to protect children in armed conflict and provide education. Of course, secondly, national laws should criminalize attacks on education and military use of education to comply with international humanitarian and criminal law, human rights treaties, recommendations of all human rights mechanisms. Only a small number, thankfully increasing, explicitly prohibits such acts in domestic law and military doctrine. It's encouraging to me that the new general comment of the African Committee of Experts on the Rights and Welfare of the Child explicitly now prohibits the targeted attacks and using learning institutions for any military use whatsoever. These are positive examples at the national and regional levels, which I really think need to be highlighted, supported, and emulated. We can learn from what people are doing. Third is strengthening international and national mechanisms for accountability, remedy, and reparation for education-related crimes. We need to support the work of the ICC and Special Representative of Children and Armed Conflict, enhance cooperation with the monitoring and reporting mechanism, and ensure victims' right to truth, justice, and reparations. Indeed, education itself is a form of reparation that victims often prioritize, especially the young. Fourth, prioritize education in national emergency preparedness and recovery plans. Treat education as a life-saving humanitarian assistance essential for recovery and resilience that is planned for, funded, and protected alongside food, water, health, and shelter. Fifth, ensure continuous, inclusive, and safe quality education during armed conflict, including by using flexible modalities such as community-based learnings, and ensure support for those who are often left behind the first and for the longest, such as teachers, girls, displaced children, and children with learning disabilities. 6, prevent the ideological manipulation of education and safeguard educational content against distorted curricula that incite hatred or erase particular histories or identities. Education is never neutral, but it must never be weaponized. It should cultivate understanding and peace. 7th, enhance systematic and disaggregated data collection and monitoring, which are indispensable for both accountability and evidence-based policymaking. And finally, 8th, engage constructively with non-state armed groups to safeguard education during conflict, and we've heard some of the examples. So I urge all member states to translate commitments into action, by adopting national laws, persecuting perpetrators, funding education in emergencies, endorsing and implementing the Safe Schools Declaration and its guidelines, as well as other international commitments around armed conflict. Some of the key challenges are overly permissive interpretations of international humanitarian law, the non-observance of civilian protection, the justification of non-compliance on the grounds of counterterrorism or self-defense, widespread disregard for human rights, dramatically reduced funding for human rights and social sectors, including education, in tandem with rising defense budgets and expenditures. Finally, I want to stress that education is not just a fundamental right. In times of conflict, it is a lifeline, a source of protection, stability, and hope. A functional school can mean safety from recruitment, sexual violence, child labor, forced and early marriages, and exploitation. It can offer psychosocial healing and preserve the continuity of communities and hope, as we've heard from the young people. Protecting education in conflict is not only a humanitarian imperative, I believe it's a legal right and moral test of our shared humanity. But finally, education in and post-conflict cannot be business as usual. It must offer ways to heal trauma, which is fear, loss, losing loved ones, the loss of limbs, or of both learners and educators. And this needs using culturally appropriate ways of engagement that bring in our emotional state and our psychological state. This is not just about math, reading, writing. It has to go beyond. And the most creative ways I have seen include drama and music and artistic visual arts. And in the height of Sri Lanka's conflict, for instance, there was something called the Butterfly Garden, which worked with children. And they say we work with art, heart, and earth. And this is something which I think is important. We have instances of the Landscapes of Hope, which is currently working with people from Syria, Iraq, and now with Palestine. So I think these are the things that we need to think of. Dreaming, to me, and we've heard the young people, I love that, because I have constantly said, dreaming is when you dream of a better reality, it's the first step to changing where we are today. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Farida, and for really highlighting the 8 urgent and actionable priorities and encouraging everyone in the room and also online. If you haven't downloaded the report yet, you can do so on the OHCHR website. Read it in detail, distribute it, and share it with those that you're working with. So we are running a little bit behind time, and the room will be used by another event at 2. So turning right away to Ilaria Paolazzi, the Senior Advocacy and Policy Advisor of the Global Coalition to Protect Education from Attack. If you could share your thoughts in some 5 minutes, we're very grateful. Thank you, Ilaria.
Thank you very much. Let me start by saying that GCPA welcomes the Special Rapporteur policy brief as a real milestone in international standard setting. We think that for too long, the protection of education has been viewed mainly through a narrow interpretation of international humanitarian law. And while, of course, IHL remains essential, it is not sufficient. So your report rightly insists on the human rights-based approach, one that recognizes that the right to education continue to apply before, during, and after conflict, and that states have positive obligations to protect learners and teachers, and especially ensure justice as well when remedies when violations occur. So this human rights framing is crucial for addressing, as you said earlier, one of the most pervasive, but also, preventable practices, which is the military use of schools and universities. Too often, armed forces evaluate this issue only in terms of military necessity without really considering the human rights consequences. Yet, occupying a school endangers students and teachers, interrupts learning, and can have lifelong impacts on students' and teachers' safety and education. Military use often disrupts education and thus violates human rights violations, even when it might be in accordance with IHL. So we particularly welcome that the policy brief asks states explicitly to recognize the guidelines for protecting schools and universities from military use during armed conflict as minimum standards, and also that recommends states that they explicitly prohibit and criminalize this practice in domestic law. We also welcome the policy brief's call for states to review and strengthen their domestic legal frameworks. In this spirit, I want to share that GCPA is developing a legislative checklist at the moment, which is going to be a practical tool to help states, lawmakers, prosecutors, national human rights institutions to assess whether the domestic legal frameworks are in compliance with obligations under both IHL, international human rights law, and international criminal law. We also strongly endorse the Special Rapporteur's emphasis on monitoring, accountability, and justice. GCPA's Education Under Attack reports show that without credible, independent monitoring and investigation, violations recur and impunity persists. We are about 6 months now ahead of the launch of the next edition of Education Under Attack, which will surely, unfortunately, once again underscore the scale, gravity, and persistence of attacks on education worldwide. Let me also say that GCPA is deeply concerned about the growing constraints on the monitoring and reporting mechanisms, but also independent monitoring by UN bodies, by civil society, on the ground due to the funding crisis, as well as the mounting challenges that they are facing globally. To help these gaps, address these gaps, GCPA is developing a trainer of trainers program based on its monitoring toolkit, which is designed to build the capacity of states, NHRIs, and civil society to monitor attacks on education and effectively and in line with international standards. So we hope that these tools can, help the development of good practices. Madam Special Rapporteur, your policy brief could not come at a more urgent time. Attacks on education and military use are on the rise. We know military spending is increasing and the disarmament and protection agendas are on the strain. We want to echo everyone's call to use this policy brief for taking action, including ahead of the 5th International Conference, as we heard earlier, that is going to take place in Nairobi on the 25th and 26th of November this year. The conference is in the framework of the 10th anniversary of the Safe Schools Declaration, so it presents the perfect opportunity to announce new endorsements. We only have 121 as of today, which is a good number, but we obviously want more. So we want to conclude by calling on states to take this opportunity and make an announcement at the conference on new endorsements and also new and renewed commitments, concrete commitments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ilaria. Now turning over on practical solutions for non-state armed groups to Sandra Krenman, who's the head of policy, research and legal unit at Geneva Call. Also, if you could keep your interventions to 5 minutes maximum, please.
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you very much for the Global Hub for the invitation, but especially also for the Special Rapporteur. And I know it has been said several times, but I actually do want to express my appreciation again for you not just having picked up the question of the right to education in armed conflict, but the very holistic and comprehensive way how you have addressed it, including actually by having a specific recommendation on the need to engage armed groups on the protection of education when we look at armed conflicts. And we have all heard, the numbers now, they are in the report. We have heard them again now in the different interventions. So we know that the number of armed conflicts is on the rise. we know that the number of attacks against schools has been on the rise. When it comes to armed groups, and I think these are two elements that we need to take into account because they actually highlight why we need to speak about armed groups. The first is that the number of armed groups has of course also increased, but it has increased exponentially when we compare it to the number of armed conflicts. So we have an increasing number of armed groups in an armed conflict. And then the second element is that the number of people who live in the territory that are either under the full or exclusive control of armed groups has also increased dramatically. So estimates are always around this year, I think there will be around 210 million of people who live in areas that are full or partially controlled by armed groups. So that obviously also means that education in these areas is delivered under the control of armed groups. And that's a specific protection challenge that needs to be addressed. So as Geneva Call, for those of us who don't know Geneva Call, we're a humanitarian organization and we specifically work on engaging armed groups on the protection of civilians by advocating for what we call humanitarian norms that includes for us both IHL and actually also human rights law. So we're also happy to see this combination in the report where there is a human rights-based approach, but it also very well engages with IHL and with international criminal law precisely to create this comprehensive framework that we need when we are as a humanitarian organization also active in an armed conflict, that there are different frameworks that need to come together in order to achieve a holistic approach to the protection of civilians. Very practically, what we do with armed groups, we are very well known for our approach, which is that we try to foster ownership, that you need to own the rules in order to comply with the rules. And for that, we have a signature tool that we call the Deed of Commitment, which is a standard document that we can invite armed groups to sign. We do have a Deed of Commitment on the protection of children from the effects of armed conflict that includes the protection of education. And to date, we have 31 signatories. As with the Safe School Declaration, of course, the important thing is not to sign, but the important thing is then actually to implement. And we have different tools that we use to accompany armed groups in the implementation. So we will often work on code of conduct, but also on much more concrete measures like age assessment modules, for example. We often see that there is strong commitment to protect education, but there are often gaps and challenges when it comes to operationalizing and implementing it, such as, for example, a lack of protocols on how to evacuate schools if a school has been occupied at one point, or a lack of response mechanism, or a lack of capacity on identifying schools that are at risk. And let me conclude with the last point, which I particularly appreciate also in the report, and it has been said now again, there is a structural legal gap that also armed groups see, namely that schools as such are protected as a simple civilian object and they can lose their protection. They do not benefit from special protection as, for example, hospitals or some cultural property. So for an armed conflict, it means they can lose protection very quickly. And I think that's where there's the value of the Safe School Declaration as a policy framework to remedy, at least as a matter of good practice, part of this lack of legal protection. And at Geneva Call, we use the Safe School Declaration actually in this sense to advocate for and avoiding the school for military purposes by armed groups. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Sandra, for very clearly outlining how the protection of education regards the non-state armed groups and very practical examples how you in Geneva Call are addressing them. So we do have a last esteemed speaker, Esther Dingeman, the Executive Director of the Global Survivors Fund, who will speak to us about remedial action for survivors of attacks. Esther, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Petra. And thank you to all the organizers and particularly the Special Rapporteur. and your office for the release of this incredibly important report. And I'm very pleased that for the first time, an UN official document specifically recognizes education as a form of reparation, and you spoke about it a little bit. With that, I will focus my remarks on a particular aspect of armed conflict, but a very important one, and that is conflict-related sexual violence and the link to education and reparation. By way of brief introduction, the Global Survivors Fund was founded by Dr. Dennis Mukwege and Ms. Nadia Murad, particularly to provide access to reparation for survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. And in our work, reparation for children is a key priority. In armed conflict, as you know, scores of children face atrocities, including sexual violence, and sexual violence is often used as a weapon. And similar as attacks on schools, sexual violence is really used to do maximum harm. So not only to harm individuals, but to really target the social tissue of societies and communities. Right now, reports of DRC and Sudan in the ongoing conflicts there show that at least a third of all the victims of conflict-related sexual violence, and there are many, are under 18. In Iraq, children as young as 9 years old were taken into captivity for years. And in Nigeria, we've heard it today, thousands of children were abducted from schools or on their way to school at the hands of Boko Haram. Also in Ukraine right now, we see that children are among the survivors of sexual violence. And just like adults, children of victims of human rights violations have this right to reparation. This right to reparation is guaranteed under numerous international instruments. Specifically, I want to mention the Committee on the Rights of the Child, General Comment number 5, in line with Article 39 of the Convention. Reparation is a key pillar of transitional justice. It means as much as recognizing the harm that has been done, compensating the harm that's been done, supporting victims in their rehabilitation, but also providing a sense of justice. Now, how can you provide reparation to a child, particularly a child that has suffered sexual violence or was forced to witness sexual violence or was born from rape? That is very, very challenging. And at Global Survivors Fund, we find it really difficult, actually, to find appropriate measures that are reparative for children. Most children that are victims of sexual violence, they don't fight for their rights. On the contrary, they're quite invisible. Sometimes parents also prefer not disclosing what happened to their children. So reaching them in the first place is very difficult. With this, these children are also not in the classrooms. They very often drop out from school. This is related to stigma, livelihoods, but also fistula, the trauma, many, many reasons. And what is more, they don't succeed in reintegrating into school. So this is a really large group that drops out from school and risks seriously never going back to school. Now, how can you then do reparation? A few years ago, and you talked about dreaming and concrete, beautiful programs like the Butterfly Program. Last year, I was in Nigeria, in Borno State, witnessing the work of one of our partners. It's the Neem Foundation, and they are supporting girls that are affected by Boko Haram through trauma-informed, value-based education. And when I stepped into that school, the school is called Lafia Sarari, you can really feel that warm, nurturing environment. It was all around creative expression, about arts, a trauma-informed curriculum. The teachers, they are like social workers. So at that moment, I really thought, aha, this is reparation. This is reparation for children that are affected by sexual violence, but also other atrocities. And in fact, you mentioned it, Special Rapporteur, in your report, around the world, when you ask children, whatever atrocities they've witnessed, what does reparation mean to you? They say education. It's always the same answer. So what makes education reparative? It's more than that, just access. Access is simply not enough. needs to be quality education, like you said, trauma responsive, value-based, teachers that really understand the psychological needs of the children, needs to be flexible, needs to be accelerated learning programs, really responding to the realities of the children. Sometimes they've been in captivity for years, so finding the right tailored measure for children is really important. Lastly, accessibility. That's about school fees, it's about transport, but it's also for children. For example, it would surprise you, I think, that around the world, in quite a few countries, children that are born from rape don't have access to legal identity and therefore cannot go to school. It's not difficult to solve these problems. So quality, flexible, trauma-informed education is really a form of reparation. I want to end by saying we need to start, in my view, really from the bottom up. That means working in conflict zones, supporting these initiatives. There's beautiful, you mentioned an initiative, there's beautiful initiatives around the world. They're largely underfunded, but they are very, very cost effective and very scalable as well. So I think there's a treasure there that we're currently overlooking. Ultimately, reparation is a state responsibility, so we really advocate for governments to set up reparation programs themselves in a post-conflict situation with a focus on education. It's not yet existing sufficiently, but there is also really a lot of goals to achieve there. I think it's a moral imperative, also a strategic one. It's cost effective, but really an investment in long-term recovery as well.
Thank you very much, Esther, for sharing the perspective from the Global Survivors Fund and pointing to the fact that we actually have solutions at hand that are beautiful, that are scalable, and that should be much more invested in. We are running out of time, but we will take maybe 2 brief interventions from the floor. If you, yes, could just, so maybe one and another one. We're going a little bit over time, but we will manage, please.
Thank you very much. I'm Anthony Swande from the Nomadic Pastoral Community in Burkina Faso. Just to highlight something that's happening about, you are talking about conflict everywhere, but I needed something to highlight something happening in the Sahel region. We are going through what we call the terrorism, but it's the matter of education. The Sahel region have been really going through lack of education for centuries. Since the colonization, this part of the world, especially where we call the Litako-Gourma region, this was abandoned by the state, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. And actually that's why today the situation become uncontrollable because of the terrorism situation. They are able to recruit among the young people there who are not educated. This is the main problem. And especially among the Fulani community and the Tuaregs, unfortunately, because they are not educated. There is nothing the government are doing for them. And now, government, even there are a lot of discrimination against Fulani and Tuaregs. And this is what's happening. That's why I want to highlight the part of this world. And I hope something will be done to save a lot of children. Millions of children are living in that area, and they need really help, especially to focus on the nomadic communities. Thank you.
Thank you very much. One more intervention, and then we will have to close. Yes, over to you. If you can also introduce yourself, please.
Yes, so I had a question about the report. So the report is really clear that whenever educational institutions are used for military purposes, they are going to lose their civilian protection status. So at the state level of action, you guys recommended incorporating the Safe Schools Declaration guidelines into military doctrine. However, at the local level beyond that, what can governments also advocate for within some of their policy initiatives for local school principals, educators, and then community leaders to proactively plan with risk management to ensure that a school is not used as a military objective?
Thank you very much. Over to the GCPA to give a brief response to this very relevant question, of course.
Thank you. The brief response, and I can share more materials, more detailed materials if you would like. But the brief response will be that, the Safe Schools Declaration is really a tool that that provides a comprehensive approach to the protection of education. So indeed, it covers different commitments that should translate into different policies at the national, at the local, at the regional, even international level. So indeed, you need to read it as like a whole package to make it effective. And this is what we're really trying to advocate, and what we work with states, when we provide technical assistance, is really to go through all the commitments and then show that there have to be complementary, policies and approaches which are very well reflected in the policy brief. So we really think it is, it is a way to push for a comprehensive set of actions. Thank you.
So I think one of the troubles, one of the issues or challenges, not troubles, but challenges, is that we can give the broad principles, but every single conflict and the impact is different. So for each, you will have to tailor from amongst the toolkit that is there. So I think that would have to depend on context and who we're talking about and the sides we're talking about, exactly what needs to be done. Thank you.
All right, so then we do come to closing, and I would like to thank again all the co-organizers of this event today. So the Office of the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Education, the Global Coalition to Protect Education from Attack, and my own entity, the Geneva Global Hub for Education in Emergencies, to all the co-sponsors, Spain, Portugal, Norway, and Colombia. Thank you very much. My notes are not visible anymore. So the discussion today, I believe, has very clearly brought into sharp focus the sobering reality that too often classrooms are at the front line. The evidence presented by the Special Rapporteur is both urgent and undeniable, and I believe we have heard it very clearly here in Geneva, and we are taking this forward. So today's exchange has shown from very different perspectives, be it from legal, but also remedial, from non-state armed actors, how we can go forward, and that progress is indeed possible when there is the respective funding and the political will. So to move forward, our collective responsibility is clear. We need to turn these global norms into concrete measures that prevent attacks, punish perpetrators, and protect education in the most difficult contexts. Thank you all very much, and I wish you a good rest of this day.
Thank you very much.